Well, thank you very much, Dr. K, for coming on the show today. We're here at the Hack Secret 5 house in ETH Denver. Dr. K, you're the co-founder of Quai Network. So we've been chatting a bit. Tell me a bit about the origins behind Quai Network.
Yeah, so I personally kind of got into Bitcoin as at least a hobbyist in 2012. And what originally attracted me to it was sort of the libertarian underpinnings, specifically sort of separating money from the state so that you could have sort of free sovereign money for free sovereign individuals. Once I finished my doctorate, I went to work at Consensus, and I've always been working towards building tools to sort of facilitate the realization of that goal of having money that's separate from the state. When I was at Grid Plus, I was sort of working on the UI UX problem and designed and built this thing called the Lattice One hardware wallet. And we were able to sort of abstract seed phrases into what looks like a debit card.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of use my sort of mom as the design criteria of what's required to get sort of ubiquitous adoption of cryptocurrencies. So she knows how to use a debit card. So if we can abstract crypto to a debit card experience.
I like your thinking. I do genuinely like your thinking, yeah.
And as I was doing this, one of the things that we started to realize was that the chains themselves were also a limit in terms of what they could do to scale. And the sort of imposition on the UX using sort of an L1, L2 model and having fragmentation and different chains and asset liquidity separation and everything was not going to really make a good system. So I started to think about how you could really scale an L1 to answer this question of how to get ubiquitous adoption of cryptocurrencies. So at some point in 2018, I came up with this idea of a hierarchy of merge mine blockchains. And I kind of called this concept block reduce. And it was very much just like an engineering approach of, what are the limitations of a blockchain in terms of, compute, bandwidth, et cetera, and how do you make those better?
Mm-hmm.
And the sort of idea that I came up with was, well, you can use sharding, you can use subnetting, and in this hierarchy of merge mine chains, you can still get consensus in a proof of work setting. So that was sort of the genesis of the idea.
Nice thing.
And
could I just ask, so why did you want to stay with proof of work as opposed to examine some of the other options that are?
Yeah, so with proof of work, I think the thing that it showed us is if you look at Bitcoin, it's the first sort of objectively verifiable system.
Mm-hmm.
And what it's really trying to do is create sort of a new language for humans. So language is like very valuable. It's one of the reasons that sort of sapiens won out, or Homo sapiens won out. But it's a highly interpretive thing. So it's very imprecise. It's very subjective. And we now have the tools with Bitcoin. It was basically showing that we can create language that's based off math. And so then that makes language an objective process.
Mm-hmm.
And an objective process which ideally can coordinate humans at scale.
Okay.
Right. But if you look at the characteristics of proof of work, those are like objectively verifiable and they're also immutable. If you look at the characteristics of proof of stake, they're not as objectively verifiable and they're certainly not mutable. So you're sort of losing those properties and moving from what you might consider to be economic consensus into a more form of social consensus.
Yeah.
But with social consensus, you can then mutate the meaning of the language, which then reintroduces subjectivity.
Yeah.
So I see proof of work as being objective and economic, whereas proof of stake becomes more subjective and so.
Okay, so you wanted to stay with the original basics, but make it better.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me about how you're making it better.
Yeah, so the original idea was this hierarchy merge mine blockchains, which allows us to shard state without sharding work. But it effectively uses these like common database scaling techniques to sort of make more throughput on a blockchain. But the concept with the sort of the insight was how you can do that while still having proof of work consensus, which is that merge mine hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
so that idea, I kind of wrote as a paper. I called it Block Reduce. I published sort of a summary of it on the 10th anniversary of Bitcoin, white paper, and I presented it to a prof at UT. He kind of got a group of students together. We started doing like a little part-time research project, and he eventually got an NSF grant. And we worked on that NSF grant for a couple years. And then in 22, we got funding from Polychain Capital and Alumni Ventures, and started working full-time on it. Took us 3 years to like work out the implementation. And then we went live in the beginning of the month. We started mining the Genesis block on February 4. Gas turned on the 19th, then it started working and trading, and yeah, so 7 years kind of from
Wow.
concept to going live.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
So you're kind of making proof of work cool again. It's kind of like one of your taglines. Am I right? Am I stealing that from?
Yeah. So fundamentally, with blockchains or cryptos as we see them, every system that's decentralized hasn't really moved past the proof of concept phase. And that if you actually have product market fit and it needs to scale, or you want to take a Web 2 scale business and put it on Web 3, there's no decentralized blockchain that's technologically sufficient to allow you to do that. So with Quai, we're trying to address the problems of scale while also maintaining the properties of decentralization and the objective properties of work. So if you want like simple terms, you could say we're taking like the best of Bitcoin, the best of Solana, and the best of Ethereum, and maybe like the best of USDC, and we're sort of putting it all in one system.
I like simple terms. Okay, that's cool. Now, you have 2 tokens. You mentioned that earlier. You started off with a token, then you brought in the gas token. Tell me, there's a Quai, which is like a gas token, is that right?
So let me frame this a little bit, and then we'll talk about the token.
Yeah.
So the goal of Quai is to create a decentralized global monetary system.
Okay.
And a monetary system actually has to have 3 functions. It needs to be a store of value, it needs to have a unit of account, and it needs to have a medium of exchange.
Yes.
And so we've introduced 2 tokens to accomplish those 3 properties. So Quai is an EVM-compatible smart contracting deflationary token. Chi is what we call an energy dollar. So it is sort of a flat coin, which is a stable coin alternative, which is meant to create a crypto native, non-fiat referenced alternative to the US dollar.
And that is directly, because I was chatting about it earlier, what is a flat coin as opposed to a stable coin? A stable coin, of course, is pegged typically to the dollar. So the dollar it fluctuates. But am I right in saying that a flat coin shouldn't, well, it's not pegged to the dollar, so it's not going to fluctuate with a dollar for starters. What would make a flat coin fluctuate, or should it not fluctuate?
So there's different constructions that you could make of flat coins. So flat coins, depending on the construction, they're basically saying that you're referencing something that's not sort of currently a monetary unit. So you could potentially construct a flat coin on energy is what we're doing, but you could do it on gold. That would hypothetically be a flat coin. Now, it's important to us that, it's a non-custodial system, because if you're trying to make crypto that's decentralized, you obviously can't be custodial. But the concept of, and the purpose of a dollar is that you can have a unit of account which you can create contracts and settle contracts in, or price goods and services, right? And what you need for that to happen is you need something that has relatively consistent purchasing power over 12, 18 months, right? So what we're trying to do with Chi is take a universal objective reference, in this case, the energy cost that the miners pay, tokenize that using a couple market mechanisms to create an energy referenced token that has consistent purchasing power over that same 12 to 18 month period, so that you can actually create an independent unit of account to fiat and nation.
Okay, and that's good, because volatility is fine if you're a day trader, but if you're someone who wants to exchange value, you want to have something that's flat.
Yeah, you want something that has consistent purchasing power. It's like the statement, right? And I will point out, in crypto, 70% of transactions by value currently are happening in stables. So in terms of like what you can accomplish, the majority of the market and the majority of the use cases needs a stable alternative to work. You can't create economies, you can't create contracts, and you can't price goods in Bitcoin or Ethereum. Everybody does it in currently USD stable.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I'm kind of jumping here now, but you tell me, if you make the segue for me, please. I've been told to ask you about liquid mining tokens.
Right. Okay. Before we get there, I just want to point out.
Thank you. Yes.
With Chi, is this energy dollar?
Yeah, sorry.
So it fulfills the other two properties of the monetary system because it creates a unit of account, and there's also some things in there that give it cash-like privacy properties, so it can function as that medium of exchange. And to segue into the question of liquid mining tokens, this will be a little bit of a segue here.
I've been told these are important things beyond.
So liquid mining tokens. There's a lot of sort of new economic designs and primitives here that we've introduced to try to make the most competitive system possible, right? So there's a couple parts. So one is when we picked our mining algorithm, we wanted to pick a GPU-friendly algorithm because we don't like the sort of centralization characteristics associated with ASICs, the manufacturing, the distribution, etc. So GPUs have much lower entry costs for boutique or hobby miners, and they're much more ubiquitously available. So if we're successful and we ever sort of challenge certain national currencies, the one thing that nation states will continue to be good at for some period of time is regulating the import-export of hardware. So if you had a network that was dependent on ASICs, there would be an easy sort of choke point in which countries could sort of ban your ASICs, and then nobody would get access to your network. Alternatively, if you use GPUs, you can sort of guarantee access because they're used for, inference, they're used for AI training, they're used for rendering, et cetera, et cetera. It's like the future of compute. So it'd be much harder to sort of limit availability and access to GPUs and therefore the network. Now, the problem that gets set up there in a proof-of-work system is there are sort of good security arguments related to sunk capital costs associated with ASICs that don't exist for GPUs because they are general purpose. So what we did is we introduced this concept for the miners. Not only do the miners get to choose between Quai or Chi, but they also get to choose if they want to lock the reward for 3, 6, or 12 months. They lock it for 12 months, we give them 25% extra in the reward, and it's sort of a normalized bond curve for 3 and 6. But what that does is it encourages the miners to effectively lock up capital so that the GPU miners then start to have the same capital sort of security as ASICs without actually having the ASIC hardware.
Okay.
So we've done it from a economic resilience security standpoint. Now, the problem here is, will the miners be able to float all of that capital? So what you can do, not in the protocol layer, but in the application layer, is you can let them mine those rewards to a contract. They can put them in tranches, and those tranches look a lot like NFT bonds, if you will. So then they can source outside capital to come in and stake. From a capital perspective, it looks like you're just buying yield or staking. And from a mining perspective, you're getting sort of extra revenue for mining, and you're splitting the difference depending on the sort of aggregate supply to aggregate demand of capital to produce locked mining rewards. And then those are then tradable, so then people actually can start to take yield, and they can start creating sort of derivatives on changes in yield and all sorts of interesting things. But there's a natural rate of money intrinsic to the system.
Do miners have to be very sophisticated that sounds quite complex.
So from a miner's perspective, what they're trying to do is maximize their ROI. So they just want to make a marketable instrument. So if they see that they can clear sort of 12-month locked rewards, they'll mint them. And then the people that are buying them are sort of the more sophisticated capital speculators.
Okay, now next question. And again, these sound unrelated, but you're going to relate them for me, right? Work shares.
Okay, work shares.
I know this is your team. I'm sorry, you're your team. I said, what am I going to ask Dr. K? Because I had a lot of very boring questions to ask you, like, tell me about the background. Tell me about. I said, ask these questions.
It's okay. So work shares function. They probably actually do about 9 things in the system, but maybe I'll only cover about 3 of them. So one problem with Bitcoin mining is that if you're a Bitcoin miner, there's a ton of hash rate, and even if you have a lot of hardware, you don't get paid very consistently. So even if I said I had like $1 million of hardware, I'm not necessarily able to independently mine because I won't find blocks for like months at a time. So because of that, you sort of have to work in a pool, and then pools become sort of centralizing on the network. So it's not good from a sort of economic resilience standpoint. So what work shares do from the miner's perspective is we actually don't just pay for blocks, we also pay for shares. And the shares kind of look like shares in a pool. So when you're mining to a pool, you sort of submit a piece of work. Doesn't meet sort of the block difficulty, but it has some number of leading zeros, so it represents statistically sort of how much hash rate you have. And then this goes to the pool gets the reward, and then they eventually sort of split up the rewards amongst people pro rata based off of the amount of hash they have as measured by the shares. In our system, that's all done in the blockchain. So instead of paying once per block, there's up to 16 shares that can be included per block, which means you get paid 16 times as frequently.
So you got consistency of income then.
That's correct. Without having to like participate in a pool. You can independently run a node and independently mine, and you'll still, even with like 1 or 2 GPUs, get paid potentially daily, even if the network is like as big as Bitcoin.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, there's going to be another one now. Warning, what is the next one? POEM. POEM. So consensus algorithm for faster finalities.
Yeah, so POEM stands for proof of entropy minima, and it is the first causally invariant consensus mechanism.
What is a causally variant?
Okay, so when we talk about consensus, there's sort of 2 processes that have to take place to get to consensus. You first have to get what we call consistency, which is you have seen the same data that I have seen. Okay. And then in any existing system, even though we've seen the same data, there's no guarantee that we'll agree on what the consensus of the system is. So we won't be able to still agree on, this is the tip of the blockchain or this is the tip of the blockchain. So we've seen the same data, but we can still be in disagreement. And it's only sort of statistically with time that we're likely to come probabilistically into agreement, if that makes sense. So there's no guarantee we'll ever agree. We're just more and more likely to agree as time passes.
Okay.
That makes it very hard to shard systems, right? So when you talk about going cross-chain or going cross-shard, basically you can't transmit state from one shard to another unless you're fully sure that we're in agreement in the first before you go to the second.
Okay.
So what POEM does, the statement of causal invariance, is that consensus necessarily happens immediately with consistency. So if we are consistent, we will necessarily agree.
Okay.
And that allows us to create shards without having these really long times between sort of referencing state between shards.
Okay.
So POEM is one of these fundamental mechanisms that we had to come up with to scale a sharded blockchain system. So much so that one of our advisors, Stephen Wolfram, who is the CEO of Wolfram Alpha, which produces Mathematica, has a fundamental theory of physics. And his fundamental theory of physics hypothesizes that all of physics is an emergent property of existing in a causally invariant multi-way graph. Our blockchain has become a causally invariant multi-way graph. So somehow we ended up creating a convergent analogous manifestation of a fundamental theory of physics to be able to scale a blockchain.
Can you summarize that into something that's at smaller words? Because I'm sure if I go back and read that, it'll make sense. But for someone just listening, if you listen, it's hard to pick it. So what is the outcome of employing POEM?
So the outcome of employing POEM is that we can effectively shard without limit.
Thank you.
And if you can shard without limit, you can scale without limit.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. That's good. And I appreciate your other explanation too. So just someone's listening. If someone's, it's hard to go, what was said there? I understand those words.
So
Okay.
so I will also say we have about 10 hours of podcast with Stephen Wolfram if people want to like
Okay.
hear that progression.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of depth here that I apologize for being on the surface very much so. Like dragonfly. I've also, the last thing that your team gave me, and again, you have to blame your team for showing these things at you. They said, we're not Terra.
Huh.
So would you like to explain what makes you not Terra?
So in this system, we have two tokens, Quai and Chi. And when you introduce two tokens, people get nervous because of Terra Luna. And effectively, the construction of Terra Luna, I read it, and within 3 minutes, I was like, that will never work. It was obvious to anyone who understands economics, game theory, anything, that this was a bad idea from the get. And then obviously it imploded and cost people a lot of money and kind of ended the last cycle. So with our system, so with the Terra, the reason that happened is really twofold. One is that UST had a much higher market cap than Luna. And Luna was kind of the token that allowed redemptions at par with $1 for UST. So if you have sort of your stable coin that is designed to have a market cap that's bigger than your collateralizing coin, you've already set yourself up for what you call a negative funding rate, and you're going to put yourself into a death spiral. The other thing that you're setting yourself up for is a death spiral due to a hard peg. So you have assets that don't have any fundamental referencing back to dollars, but you're creating dollar-denominated debts. And so when you get volatility in price of Luna, you potentially can end up in a situation where you can't meet your debt requirements. So there's basically no relation between the design, except for the fact that there's two tokens and one of them is some form of a flat coin or stable coin alternative. So in our system, the reason that this can't happen is one, Chi is an asset, not a liability. Because Chi has to be produced from creating hashes, it effectively represents hashes in the system. And there's no sort of redemptive value for it. So what is a Chi worth? It's worth a Chi. It's not worth $1. It's not worth anything else. If you want to produce a Chi, like you have to dispose of the hashes.
Yeah.
So there's no debt obligation. It's an asset.
Mm-hmm.
And if the market chooses to trade that asset at different prices, so be it. The other piece of it is this sort of exchange rate that we have between Quai and Chi. If there were sort of a point of volatility and people were to panic, what would end up happening is both Quai and Chi would technically move away from their equilibrium values. And anyone that's selling into a non-equilibrium state would be losing money, and their impermanent loss would actually cause re-equilibration of the system. So no matter like how much you like shock the system,
Mm-hmm.
it will still go back to equilibrium. And anyone who's like panicking in the meantime are the ones that are going to take the loss. So that's kind of like how that works. Now, the one other thing that I'll point out too with Quai is that Quai is designed to have a much more inelastic price curve than Chi, right? Quai is emitted proportional to the log of half of the system, whereas Chi is emitted proportional to half. So Quai is meant to have very inelastic supply, whereas Chi is meant to have perfectly elastic supply. So one of the things that's very interesting about this system is that every time a Chi is produced, it comes at the cost of a Quai. It means that somebody chose Chi over Quai,
Mm-hmm.
or somebody took Quai and burned it to create Chi. And every time you create Chi, instantaneously, it looks like a market buy of Quai and the value of one Chi, if that makes sense. So every time Chi is created, it actually increases the market cap of Quai. And this always guarantees that Quai is at a high multiple of market cap relative to Chi.
Okay.
So it becomes impossible to sort of set up this like Terra Luna scenario.
We don't want to go back there again.
Right.
Okay, so you went live this month, February 2025. Just tell me a little bit about the roadmap going forward. What's going to happen? I mean, you're going for mass adoption. You want to be the cryptocurrency of choice.
So our goal isn't even being the cryptocurrency of choice. Our goal is to be fixing issues. And any upgrades that we may do to the client would just be sort of to enhance performance, but would be non-consensus. So
that is unique, isn't it? I don't think everybody I speak to has a roadmap, and there's technology in that roadmap.
Right.
It's changed, and you've done the 7 years, so you're just here's the baby.
Yeah, that's right.
And the gestation, done growing.
Yeah, so like
baby.
the I would say we're 98% done. I'm not gonna have the hubris to say that it's 100% perfect. We have gotten it as close as we can, and maybe there's like emergent things that we have to figure out. But we're pretty sure it's all there and it all works. So we're not sort of saying we know how to scale. We are saying we have built the system which will scale, which is unique. And so then our roadmap isn't technical in the form of the protocol. It is only sort of technical in sort of go-to-market and adoption.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to get this wrong. Am I meant to ask you why or why not? Which one am I meant to ask you?
You're going to ask me Quai.
Quai.
And I'm going to tell you Quai not.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant.